The pub materialized out of the wall of dirty glass and chipped brick the way certain things did. Harry was coming to understand. In the world Hagrid kept gesturing toward, sideways, through gaps where he hadn't thought to look. One moment there was nothing but a black wooden door, grimed at the bottom, and then Hagrid had his vast hand flat against it, and they were inside, and the door swung shut behind them with the sound of someone pressing their thumb over the end of a bottle. It was very warm. The smell was of pipe smoke and old wood, and something Harry couldn't place, something rich and a little earthy, like the inside of a cupboard that had held something good. It was nothing like the cupboard under the stairs, which smelled of dust and the particular damp that came from the plumbing that ran through the wall. Harry had lived in that cupboard for as long as he could remember. He knew the smell of it the way he knew the sound of Uncle Vernon's footsteps on the landing, by what they meant, by what they preceded. He hadn't expected warmth. He hadn't expected much of anything, really. Hagrid had said there was a place they needed to go, and Harry had gone, because Hagrid was nearly 11 feet tall and had bent the barrel of a gun into a knot with his bare hands, and had called Vernon Dursley a muggle, which had made Vernon flinch so badly that he'd knocked his chair backward into the stove. You followed someone like that without asking many questions. The pub was dim and low-ceilinged and crowded in the way that small spaces became crowded, not from numbers, but from presence, from the kind of people who took up a great deal of room without necessarily being large. They sat at tables with bottles and cups in front of them, and they turned when Hagrid ducked through the doorway. And they turned because of Hagrid, and then their eyes slid down and caught on Harry, and their faces changed. He had no frame of reference for what he was seeing. He had spent 10 years learning to read the faces of people who looked at him with irritation or dismissal or the blank performance of not seeing, and this was none of those things. This was something more frightening, in the way that unexplained warmth was sometimes more frightening than cold. "Bless my soul," somebody said. Is that Harry Potter?" And then it began. He shook hands. He shook so many hands. A woman with curly hair and bright eyes seized both of his and pumped them up and down with the fervent joy of someone who had been waiting years to do exactly this, and when he finally retrieved his hands, she circled back and did it again. He was aware of her face, open with feeling, unguarded in a way adult faces almost never were, and he did not know what to do with it, so he looked past her. A man in a top hat went so unsteady at the sight of him that the hat slid off his head and hit the stone floor with a dull thump, and the man barely seemed to notice, staring at Harry with bright, damp eyes over the brim of what he was holding. Someone else pressed forward to clap him on the shoulder. Someone else murmured something that Harry didn't quite catch, but which seemed to end in his name. His name was in every sentence, said the way people said things they had been waiting a long time to say aloud. Harry stood very still and looked at the middle distance. He was good at this. He'd had practice. Hagrid was beside him, and Hagrid's enormous hand settled briefly on Harry's shoulder, not steering, just present. And Hagrid was grinning, a little glassy about the eyes, visibly moved by something Harry didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Near the back of the small crowd, a young man stepped forward. He was wearing a purple turban wound carefully over the back of his head, and there was something about the turban that unsettled Harry, without explaining why. A smell, perhaps, something like garlic laid over something older and stranger. The young man's face was pale and his manner was nervous, though not in the way of ordinary nervousness. Harry, who had spent a decade becoming an expert in the behavior of people who did not want to be noticed, recognized the particular quality of someone who was working very hard at appearing calm. "P. Potter," the young man said, and took Harry's hand. "Can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you." He let go of Harry's hand a beat too quickly. Harry noticed. He couldn't have said why he filed it away, only that he did. The crowd eased back then, the way crowds did when the thing they had all been leaning toward had finally occurred, and the old man behind the bar, bald as stone, toothless, with the permanent expression of someone who expected everything to end badly and was resigned to being right, brought drinks to the table without being asked. Hagrid settled onto a stool that groaned under his weight but held. Harry took the seat across from him and folded his hands in his lap and waited. He was very good at waiting. Hagrid drank. Hagrid smiled at people who nodded at him from across the room. Hagrid turned his great shaggy head occasionally toward Harry, and when he did, the smile rearranged itself into something that was attempting to be reassuring and not quite getting there. Harry looked at his own hands. He was still wearing Dudley's old shirt, green, 3 sizes too large at the shoulders, the cuffs past his knuckles when he didn't push them back, and the trousers Aunt Petunia had turned up because nobody else had done it. His glasses sat crooked on his nose, the bridge held together with a twist of tape where they'd broken at the end of the school year, and nobody had gotten around to fixing, which was to say that Harry had mentioned it once and had not mentioned it again. On his forehead, under the flop of his dark hair, the scar was there. The single curved mark that every person in this room seemed to recognize. The thing he had woken up with every morning for as long as he could remember, which he'd spent 10 years being told was nothing, which had turned out to be the entire reason anyone knew his name. He became aware, gradually, that Hagrid was looking at him. Not the way the others had looked, not with that wide-open reverence that still made something in his chest go uncertain, but steadily, carefully, like a man doing arithmetic in his head. Hagrid's eyes moved over Harry's hands, over the 2 long sleeves, over the taped glasses, over his face. And something was happening in Hagrid's expression while he did this, something that Harry didn't have a name for yet, though it made him want to look away. Hagrid set down his cup. "Harry," he said. "Yeah?" Hagrid was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup once around on the table. He had, Harry thought, the quality of someone who understood that the weight of him meant even words could land harder than intended, and was being careful. "Where have you been living?" Hagrid said slowly. "All this time?" Harry looked at him. The question didn't seem remarkable. No one had ever asked it before, which might have made it extraordinary, but the only things that could seem extraordinary to Harry were things he had some comparison for, and he had none for being asked. The presence of a thing and the absence of a thing could both look like nothing when you had only ever known one of them. So he answered. He answered the way you answered a question that wasn't a secret because it had never occurred to you that it might be. He told Hagrid about Privet Drive and the smallest bedroom, and before the smallest bedroom the cupboard under the stairs, where he'd slept for as long as he could remember, about Dudley's hand-me-downs that were always too large through the shoulders and too short in the leg by the time they reached him. About meals that were there mostly, that he was allowed to eat if he had done the garden and the washing up and there was enough left. About school, where he was careful not to do better than Dudley, because he had learned early what happened if he did. About the 10 years that sat between the rock hut this morning and the morning before the one in which everything had made sense, though he had not known it made sense, though he had believed it was simply the way things were. He spoke in his matter-of-fact voice. He was very good at his matter-of-fact voice. He had built it the same way you built any useful thing, out of necessity, over time. Because having it was better than not. He stopped talking. The pub was still warm around him. He folded his hands again. He looked at Hagrid. Hagrid's face was doing something that Harry had not seen on a face before and did not have a name for yet. It was not pity exactly. It was not surprise. It was the expression of a man watching something he could not stop, finally understanding that it had been happening for a very long time, without him. The wall opened like it recognized him, which was perhaps not so far from the truth. Hagrid had tapped that particular arrangement of bricks more times than he could count, and they had always obliged. He stepped through the widening archway into the brightness of Diagon Alley and looked back. Harry Potter had stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the arch with his head tipped back and his mouth slightly open, trying to look at everything at once. The towers and the crooked signs and the robed shoppers and the window displays crammed with things that moved and glittered and smelled of things you couldn't name. He was trying to take all of it in through his eyes at the same time, and his eyes were not large enough. Hagrid had never been able to see Diagon Alley the way Harry was seeing it now. He had known it too long. He had lost the capacity for it. He swallowed something that had lodged unexpectedly in his throat and waited. They went to Gringotts first, because they had to, and because it was easier to go while Harry was still dazed by everything else. The goblins behind their high marble counter looked at Harry the way they looked at everyone, with the settled patience of creatures who measured trust in gold and found most beings wanting. Harry looked back at them with the careful, polite stillness he had been wearing since the Leaky Cauldron, face giving nothing away, body taking up as little space as possible, everything very controlled. Hagrid handed over the letters. They were taken down. The cart was not something you got used to exactly, but Harry seemed less destabilized by it than Hagrid had expected. He held the side with both hands and leaned into the curves, and Hagrid, crammed uncomfortably into the seat across from him, kept watching for the white-knuckled grip or the shut eyes, and found instead a kind of absorbed attention. A child who had spent 10 years in circumstances that were frightening and small might, he supposed, have made a different kind of peace with losing control of where he was going. Vault 6, 8, 7. The key turned. The door opened on a rush of cold vault air, and Hagrid stepped back to let Harry go through first, and watched him cross the threshold and stop. Gold. Great heaping columns of galleons, more silver sickles than you could count, the smaller copper knuts scattered like dropped stitches among the larger piles, all of it caught in the torchlight and throwing it back doubled. It was not, by the standards of wizarding families who had been old for centuries, a vault to make you stagger. But Harry had gone very still in the way that Harry went still. Not blankly, not emptily, but with the concentrated quality of someone who was doing a great deal of thinking in a very short time. "All of this," he said carefully, "is mine." "All of it," Hagrid said. "Left to you by your mum and dad." Harry nodded, just once, as though the nod were an object he was placing down somewhere he would need to find again later. Hagrid thought about what Harry had said in the pub, the precise way he'd described it, the cupboard, the meals that were there if he'd done enough, the money he was handed for the corner shop and counted back when he returned. He hadn't said any of it with anger. He had said it like weather, like the arrangement of furniture in a room. That was the part that sat heaviest, not what he'd said, but the voice he'd used to say it. Hagrid scooped a good fistful of galleons into a bag and held it out. Harry took it with both hands and held it for a moment as though testing its weight, or perhaps just the fact of it. He had never had pocket money. Not once. Not in 11 years. Vault 713 came after, swift and without ceremony. Hagrid collected the small, grubby package without looking at it, without explaining it, and tucked it deep in the inside pocket of his coat. Harry glanced at it the way he glanced at things he had decided not to ask about yet. "Hogwarts business," Hagrid said. "Right," Harry said, and left it there. Back in the daylight, they went to Madame Malkin's, where Harry submitted to the measuring tape with the patience of someone who had been told to stand still in many places and for many reasons. On the stool beside him, a boy with very neat blonde hair and the bearing of someone who had never had cause to make himself smaller was also being fitted, and he turned to Harry within the first 30 seconds and began talking. Quidditch, houses. Which broom was better, which families were which. The 10,000 things that were common knowledge to every wizarding child who had grown up wizarding. Harry did not know any of them. Hagrid stood outside on the pavement, too large for the shop, and watched through the window. He watched the blond boy's expression shift as the conversation kept returning things he hadn't expected. Not rudeness, not ignorance in the offensive sense, but genuine blankness, the blankness of someone who had simply not been given the information, ever, by anyone. The blond boy's interest contracted. By the time Harry stepped down from the stool, it had become merely courtesy, and then nothing at all. Harry came out into the afternoon with his robes wrapped in brown paper and his old clothes in a bag and said, he seemed all right, with the diplomatic evenness of someone who had already assessed the situation and filed it. "Right," said Hagrid. Ollivanders was dim and wandering and slightly unreal the way all places were slightly unreal that had been doing a single thing for centuries and had stopped noticing. The wand-maker was small and pale and silver-eyed and looked at Harry with a kind of quiet attention that was different from everything else Harry had received that day. Not the reverence, not the curiosity, but the gaze of someone who kept meticulous records and was checking Harry against them, wand after wand. Harry held each one with the same careful grip, not frightened but respectful in the way he was respectful of objects that might not belong to him, which was to say with the same slight hesitation he'd brought to everything. Nothing answered. And then holly, phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple. Something ran through Harry's arm, like warmth finding somewhere to go. He looked down at the wand in his hand with an expression Hagrid had not yet seen on his face. Not wonder, not exactly, but something closer to recognition. "Curious?" the wandmaker said, and Hagrid braced himself because he'd known this was coming. "I remember every wand I have ever sold, Mr. Potter. Every single one. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather sits in your wand gave another feather, just one other. It is very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand, when its brother, why, its brother gave you that scar." A silence settled over the shop. Hagrid did not breathe. Harry turned the wand over slowly. He looked at the wandmaker. "The wand that gave me the scar," he said. Not a question exactly. More like repeating something aloud in order to understand it. "The very same." Harry looked at the wand again for a long moment. Then he looked at Hagrid, a frank, measuring look, asking not for answers but for confirmation that the question was real and that the weight of it was the weight Hagrid was also feeling. Hagrid gave a small nod that he hoped communicated yes, and we'll talk and not now, and also I'm sorry, I'm not sure this is a good enough day for this particular piece of information. Harry took his wand in its box and paid for it from the bag of galleons, carefully. He had, Hagrid noticed, counted out exactly the right amount. Outside in the long afternoon, the question didn't come. Harry walked beside him with the wand box tucked under his arm and his face doing something interior and precise. Hagrid walked with the grubby package in his coat and his own thoughts arranged in the order he was going to have to put them in front of Dumbledore tonight. "What do you want for your birthday?" Hagrid said. Harry seemed briefly surprised by the question, as though it had addressed him in an unfamiliar language. He thought about it in good faith, which was more than Hagrid had expected. "I don't need anything," he said, with the gravity of someone who had drawn that line in sand very early and kept it carefully. "Didn't ask what you needed," said Hagrid. In Aelop's Owl Emporium, Harry stood in front of a snowy owl in a cage near the back and didn't move on. She looked at him with amber eyes of absolute composure. He put one finger through the bars of the cage, and she regarded it without alarm, which was more than most of the owls had managed. Something in Harry went still in front of her, a different kind of still from his usual careful stillness, less like armor and more like comfort. "Her," he said, without taking his eyes off her. Hagrid paid without looking at the price. He set the cage in Harry's arms, and Harry received it the way he'd received the bag of galleons, with both hands, with a slight adjustment of posture, as though accounting for something that had weight and also for the fact that the weight was now his responsibility. It was, Hagrid thought, the second gift Harry Potter had ever received. The first had been that morning. A birthday cake from a man who had not yet known how much the birthday had cost. At the station, they stood on the pavement with Harry's trunk between them and the owl on top of it in her cage, and Hagrid pressed a train ticket into Harry's hand and gave him the date and the platform number and told him the train left at 11 sharp and not to be late. And Harry stood with the ticket in his hand and looked up at Hagrid with his green eyes behind their taped glasses and said, "Thank you for today." "Ye write me," Hagrid said, "if you need anything, before September." "Yeah," Harry said, "I will." He wouldn't, not yet. Hagrid knew this, the same way he knew that you could not undo 11 years in a day. But the door was open. That was what today was. A door that had been closed for 11 years, that a very large man with no talent for subtlety and no patience for cruelty had simply walked through. He watched Harry disappear into the crowd toward the Muggle platforms, small among the ordinary people, carrying his owl and his wand and a bag of gold that was his own. Then Hagrid reached into his coat pocket and felt the grubby package still there, solid and warm, and thought about the face Dumbledore would make when he told him what else he was bringing back. The castle was lit from within when Hagrid crossed the grounds, windows amber in the evening dark, the lake flat and still and keeping its own counsel. He had walked these grounds 10,000 times. He knew where the path dipped near the greenhouses, where you had to watch for the roots of the old elm, where the west gate never quite latched right unless you lifted it as you pushed. He had been at Hogwarts since he was 11, with one gap of 3 years that he did not think about. The grounds were his, in the way that a thing could become yours through sustained attendance, if not through ownership. He walked quickly, which for him was not quick in any ordinary sense, but meant only that he did not stop. In his inside coat pocket, wrapped in brown paper, sat the thing he had retrieved from Vault 713 on Dumbledore's orders. He could feel it there the way you could sometimes feel that you were carrying something with more weight than its physical weight. He had not looked at it. He did not want to know what it was. He had learned, over a long life of knowing Albus Dumbledore, that there were things Dumbledore would tell you when he needed you to know them and not before, and that pressing produced careful deflections rather than answers. You got used to this if you were fond of Dumbledore, and Hagrid was. He delivered the package first. He set it on the desk, and Dumbledore looked at it with the expression of a man confirming that something fragile had arrived undamaged, and opened a drawer and put it away, and closed the drawer, and looked at Hagrid. Hagrid had been rehearsing what to say since King's Cross. Now the rehearsed version had gone somewhere he couldn't find it. He had been in this office many times. He knew the portraits, the previous headmasters in their frames, some awake, most not, all of them with the slightly abstracted look of people who had long since stopped being surprised by what happened in this room. He knew the silver instruments on their shelves, turning and humming and measuring things he had never asked after. He knew the particular quality of the air, parchment, wood smoke, something older and harder to name, the smell of a room that had been doing its thinking for centuries. He was not afraid of Dumbledore. He had known Albus Dumbledore for over 50 years, had been given back his dignity by him and his place here, and eventually a wand of sorts, and there was not much room for ordinary fear where that kind of history lived. What he was frightened of was saying it wrong, saying it in a way that could be answered without being heard. "I got the thing from the vault," he said. "The one from 713, that's what you just put away." "Yes, thank you, Rubeus. And Harry?" "Harry's got his letter and his wand and his school things, robes fitted, a bag of gold from 687, a snowy owl he picked himself." He paused. He had his hat in his hands and was turning it, which he did not do when he was comfortable. "He's a good boy, Professor. Quiet, careful. Looks at you like he's trying to work out what's about to happen next." Dumbledore waited. His hands were folded on the desk, and his blue eyes, behind the half-moon spectacles, were attentive the way they were always attentive, giving you the full weight of him, so that you understood he was going to hear whatever you said, and hold it. "Something's bothering me," Hagrid said, "and I've got to say it." "I thought you might," Dumbledore said. So Hagrid told him. He told it plainly, the way he had always told things to people he trusted, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight and his face carry the rest. He told him about the clothes, 4 sizes too large in every direction, the kind of too large that came not from a child going through a growth spurt, but from a child being given someone else's cast-offs as a permanent arrangement. He told him about the glasses held together with tape at the bridge, not as a temporary measure, but as the ongoing state of things. He told him about the cupboard under the stairs, which had been Harry's room, as Harry had described it, for as long as Harry could remember, before the smallest bedroom, before the letters had started coming. It was the cupboard, and Harry had said this without any particular emphasis, the same way you said the kitchen or the hall, because it was simply a room and he had simply lived in it. He told him about the birthday cake. He said, Hagrid said and had to stop for a moment, that it was his first one. "The cake I brought this morning," he said. He didn't say it like it was something wrong. He said it like he was just telling me a fact. He turned his hat around again. "Like it was just what birthdays were. No cake, and then cake, and the cake was unusual, but not in a way that meant the years before it were also unusual. You understand what I mean?" "I understand," Dumbledore said. He said all of it that way, every bit of it, like reciting the weather. The study was very quiet. The instruments turned. A portrait shifted in its sleep. Dumbledore did not flinch. That was the thing about Albus Dumbledore, the thing that was sometimes harder to look at than the kindness, the stillness, the absolute architectural stillness of a man whose control was so complete that it had long since become indistinguishable from his expression. His silver beard lay across the front of his robes, and his hands lay flat on the desk, and he looked at Hagrid with the full weight of his attention and gave nothing back that Hagrid could read. When Hagrid finished, there was a pause. Then Dumbledore asked 2 questions. "Is the protection intact, Lily's blood bond through Petunia?" "Far as I can tell, he's been living there. He calls it home, not happily, but he calls it home." "Is he in immediate physical danger? Injury, illness, anything acute?" "No," Hagrid said. He let the word sit for a moment before he went on. "Nothing you'd call acute." He was not a subtle man. He had never pretended to be. But he knew that nothing you'd call acute was not the same as saying a child who had slept in a cupboard for a decade was fine. And he knew that Dumbledore knew this. And he needed Dumbledore to know he knew it too. Dumbledore heard the distinction. He always did. The silence stretched. "Thank you, Rubeus," Dumbledore said eventually. "You have done exactly what was needed today, both things." "I'm not satisfied," Hagrid said. He said it without apology because there was no way to say it with apology and mean it. "I want you to know that. I'm not satisfied and I'm not going to pretend I am." He stood up, which meant the room became considerably less spacious. "He's a good boy. He deserves better than what I found." "Yes," said Dumbledore, with the particular quality of a man who was agreeing with something he had known for a very long time and had not resolved. He does. Hagrid waited. Nothing further came. He said goodnight and went out, and the door closed behind him, and his footsteps went down the spiral stair and away. The office held its quiet. Dumbledore sat for a while without moving. The portraits drowsed. The instruments completed their slow revolutions. Outside the high window, the grounds were dark, and the lake was dark, and the sky had settled into the deep particular blue of a summer evening going toward night. He had made the decision in November of 1981, with all the information he possessed. He had weighed it carefully against every alternative, and the alternatives had each cost more than the choice he made. The blood protection was the only magic that would hold against what Voldemort was capable of. It required only one thing of Harry Potter, that he call Petunia Dursley's house home. Not that he be happy there, not that he be treated well there. The magic did not ask for happiness, only for the structural fact of home. The belief, however qualified, that the place you returned to was the place that was yours. You could not give a child something better without risking that he would believe correctly that he belonged somewhere other than Privet Drive. And if he believed that, truly believed it, the protection would fail. And if the protection failed, and Voldemort found his way back to a body, which he would eventually the shape of it only a matter of time, then Harry Potter would have no armor at all. The arithmetic was as clean as it had ever been. Dumbledore looked at his desk where the package had been. He had designed something around Lily's sacrifice that worked precisely because of what it demanded of the boy. The magic was hers. The architecture was his. And the architecture, he could see now that it had a cupboard in it, now that it had the voice of a child reciting his deprivations like weather. The architecture required that the child remain in conditions that harmed him. Not as a side effect, as a structural condition. The harm and the protection were not separable. They were the same mechanism. He had known this in the way you knew things you had reasoned your way to and then placed at the back of a drawer and did not take out again. He had held it in the abstract for 10 years, where it had the clean shape of a necessary cost, correctly weighed. It was the word cupboard that had taken it out of the drawer. He did not call what he was feeling guilt. That was not precisely the word for it yet. The word was something earlier than guilt. The quiet, cold moment in which a very old man who had spent a lifetime building things that worked looked at his most careful construction and saw for the first time clearly and without the comfort of abstraction what was holding the whole thing up. The class lists arrived on the 1st of August, as they always did. Delivered by the Castle Owls in the early morning when the corridors were empty and the light came in low through the east windows. Minerva McGonagall had been expecting them. She had been preparing for the incoming year since the middle of July, the same way she had prepared for every year for 39 of them, methodically, without sentiment, with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything she considered worth doing properly. She sat at her desk in the early morning quiet and worked through the lists with a quill and a cup of tea going cold beside her. 37 incoming first years, which was a reasonable cohort. She made notes in the margins, names she recognized from wizarding families she'd taught before, brief notations about particular circumstances worth keeping in mind. It was not very different from any other August. Until she reached the P's. Potter, Harry James. Age 11. Guardian, Petunia Dursley, née Evans. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Special circumstances, see Headmaster's file. She had always known his name would appear here eventually. She had known it since 1981, in the way you knew things you had decided not to look at directly, held at a careful remove where they had the quality of the inevitable rather than the personal. The name would come, and then September would come, and then he would walk through the door, and she would do her job. She had known all of this, and had managed, over 10 years, to keep it at that precise distance. She looked at the name for a long moment. Then she set the list down. She had met Harry Potter exactly once. He had been 15 months old and asleep, wrapped in a blanket on a doorstep, with a scar on his forehead that had not existed 12 hours before. She had watched Dumbledore set him down. She had watched him place the letter beside the sleeping child and straighten, and she had said what she needed to say, and he had listened carefully and reached the opposite conclusion, and that had been that. She had not gone back. She had not asked after him. The years had passed with the efficiency of years that are not interrupted. When Hagrid appeared in her office doorway a week into August, on a still Tuesday morning when she was partway through revising the third-year curriculum, she looked up and knew at once from the set of his face that this was not a casual visit. He held his hat in his hands. He always held his hat when he was carrying something. "Professor McGonagall," he said. "Come in, Rubeus." He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, which had accommodated him before, and did so again with a certain structural resignation. He had, she thought, the quality of someone who had been holding something for too long in too small a container and had finally found a place he trusted enough to put it down. He told her about the birthday, about the Leaky Cauldron and the crowd and the question he had asked, which no one else in that room had asked, and what Harry had answered. He told it the way he always told things, without embellishment, without ornamentation, with his face doing the work that plainer men left to their words. He told her about the hand-me-down clothes, 4 sizes too large. He told her about the glasses held together with tape. He told her about the cupboard under the stairs, which had been Harry's room for as long as Harry could remember, and about the birthday cake that morning, which had been, Harry had told him, his first. Minerva McGonagall listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Thank you, Rubeus," in a voice she was pleased to find was level. She had 39 years of practice. He nodded. He stood and put his hat back on. In the doorway, he paused. "I told Professor Dumbledore," he said, "but I thought you ought to know as well, in case—" He stopped. He found a different phrasing. "I trust you," he said. "I thought you ought to know." "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you told me." He went. She sat without moving for a moment, and then she rose and went to the window, because she could think more clearly standing than she could sitting with her hands in her lap. She had been on a wall at the corner of Privet Drive, in her other form, since before it was properly light on the 1st of November 1981. An ordinary wall, stone, at the junction of the Dursleys' street, the sort of place a tabby cat might rest without attracting notice. She had watched the street come to life, milk delivered, curtains pulled back, Vernon Dursley leaving for work with his briefcase and his self-importance, Petunia Dursley collecting the bottles from the step with a thin expression. She had spent the day watching and assessing, and her assessment had been, by evening, both thorough and damning. She had gone to meet Albus Dumbledore as herself and had told him precisely what she thought, using the phrase, "the worst sort of muggles imaginable," which she stood behind entirely and would have stood behind again. She had made the argument as clearly and completely as she knew how to make an argument, which was more clearly and completely than most people managed. He had listened with the full weight of his attention, which was the most Albus Dumbledore gave anyone, and which she had never found comforting when the conclusion he reached at the end of it was not hers. He had explained the blood bond, Lily's sacrifice, and what it had created, a love magic older and more durable than most protections she had encountered in a long career spent studying them. The bond ran through blood. Through Petunia, Lily's sister, the last blood relative Harry had, and it would hold as an impenetrable shield so long as Harry could call that house his home. Not happily, not willingly. The magic did not require happiness. It required only the structural fact that this was where he belonged, in whatever diminished form belonging could take. Remove him and the protection failed. Give him somewhere better, somewhere warm enough that he genuinely ceased to think of Privet Drive as home, and the magic would unravel, and whatever Voldemort became in the years ahead would have a clear path to the boy. She had understood this. She understood it still with the same clarity, in the August morning light with the grounds quiet outside her window, and the lake lying still and silver in the distance. The arithmetic had not changed. She would not pretend otherwise. But she had managed, for 10 years, to hold the arithmetic as an abstraction. The protection requires the placement requires the conditions are regrettable but necessary. And she had managed this because the conditions had remained abstract. The Dursleys were the worst sort of muggles imaginable. That was a category. A judgment she could examine from a remove. A cupboard under the stairs was not a category. A birthday cake that was someone's first at 11 years old because no one had given him one before. That was not a category. She had told herself for 10 years that understanding the necessity was sufficient. She could see now, clearly and without comfort, that what she had been doing was using the necessity to excuse herself from looking at the cost, that the two were not the same thing, and that she had allowed herself over 10 years to behave as though they were, as she could not undo any of it. The decade was the decade. It sat behind Harry Potter's name on the class list as immovably as stone. She could not remove him from Privet Drive, would not act unilaterally against protection built on Lily Potter's sacrifice, and would not deceive herself into thinking that any decision she made now absolved the ones she had not made before. These were facts. She did not traffic in comfortable alternatives to facts. But Harry Potter was going to walk through the door of her classroom in September, not as a name on a list, not as the boy who had done something remarkable as an infant and was therefore owed a certain reverence, not as a category or an abstraction or an item in a headmaster's file, as a boy of 11 who had just learned 5 weeks ago that he was a wizard and who had a decade of being treated as though he were invisible, and who was going to sit down in front of her and pick up a match and try to turn it into a needle. She could not give him back what the decade had taken. She could make certain that Hogwarts was not the 12th year of the same. She went back to her desk. She picked up the class list and found the P's and read the name again, and then she set down the quill and said it aloud once, quietly, in the empty room, Potter, Harry James, in the same measured tone in which she would say it in 5 weeks with the great hall full of students who would hear it very differently from how she meant it now. Not as a legend arriving, not as a symbol of something that had happened before either of them had any choice in it, as a student, coming to a school that was going to know his name, and where at least one person, when she called it, would be thinking of a boy rather than a scar. She put a small mark in the margin beside his name. Nothing that would mean anything to anyone else. Only what it meant to her, that she had noted it, specifically and without abstraction, and that she would not be noting it again for the first time. Platform 9 3/4 materialized out of nothing, the way certain things did when you had the right information and a solid wall to walk toward. Harry had found the information by accident, which was perhaps appropriate. He had been standing in the middle of King's Cross, with his trolley and his owl and his trunk, reading his ticket for the 3rd time, when a cluster of red-haired children came past him at high speed. "Come on, or we'll miss it! Platform 9 3/4, one of them shouted, and Harry turned just in time to watch the tallest one disappear sideways through a barrier that had been solid a moment ago. He stood there for a moment, then pushed his trolley after them with the pragmatic reasoning he had spent 11 years developing in a house where nothing was explained, and following was usually safer than asking. The Hogwarts Express was very red and produced a very large amount of steam. He pushed his trolley along the platform in the controlled chaos of parents and trunks and cages, found a compartment near the middle of the train that was empty, wrestled his trunk into the overhead rack with more determination than technique, set his owl's cage on the seat beside him, and sat down. The noise of the platform filtered through the window, softened and ordinary. He had left the Dursleys this morning the way he had left them every September, without being spoken to. He had not expected anything different. He sat in the familiar particular quality of his own solitude. It was not an unhappy thing, solitude. It was simply the default state, the condition that existed when nothing else was happening, and he had lived in it long enough to have furnished it reasonably well. He had small interior habits, private catalogues, the daily observations of a child who had found plenty of room inside his own head because the rooms outside it were either too full of the wrong things or too empty of the right ones. But there was something new in it today, something that had been there since July and had not quite settled. A large man looking at him in a pub, carefully, and asking where he had been living all this time. The question meaning it, the question expecting an answer. He had answered, and the world had not ended, and the man's face had done something that Harry had spent the intervening weeks trying to stop thinking about and had not managed to stop. He was still sitting with this when the compartment door slid open. The boy who put his head through was tall for his age and built along the lines of someone who had recently grown too fast for his own coordination. His hair was red, emphatically, constitutionally red, the sort of red that suggested his entire family was this way and had long since stopped commenting on it. And across his face he had freckles in the particular distribution of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He had a rat asleep in his chest pocket and a wand with a slightly second-hand look. "Do you mind? Everywhere else seems to be full." "Come in," Harry said. He moved his owl's cage to make room on the opposite seat. The boy sat down and looked at Harry with the direct, unhesitating gaze of someone who had grown up with a large number of siblings, and therefore had no instinct suggesting it might be awkward to look directly at a person. Harry had rarely been looked at this simply, without any particular frame around the looking. "I'm Ron Weasley. Harry Potter." Ron's eyes went, briefly and involuntarily, to Harry's forehead. Harry's fringe was covering the scar, which was the usual arrangement. Ron seemed to be deciding something. "Is that actually a lightning bolt?" he said. "Under there? My brothers said it was. Though Fred also once told me gnomes were carnivorous, so I've learned to verify things." Harry pushed his hair back. Ron looked at the scar with the attentive focus of someone checking a fact, and appeared satisfied in an entirely practical way, the way you were satisfied when something you had wondered about turned out to be simply true. "Did it hurt?" Ron said. "When you got it?" Harry put his hair back. He had not been asked this before. The people in the Leaky Cauldron had looked at the scar as though it were a decoration, as though it were proof of something they needed confirmed. Ron was asking about it the way you asked about any scar. Where did you get it? Did it hurt? As though it were an injury that had happened to a person and the person was worth asking. Harry found this startling in a way he didn't entirely understand, and the word startling was as close as he could get to it. "I don't remember," he said. "I was too young." "Right, obviously," Ron said, with the ease of someone dismissing a line of reasoning that had simply not led anywhere. "Are you actually good at everything? My brother Charlie said the famous ones usually turn out either completely useless or completely brilliant, and there's not much in between." "I've never done any real magic," Harry said. "Nothing on purpose." Ron visibly relaxed. "Me neither," he said. "Well, twice by accident, nothing you could call controlled." He settled further back in his seat, apparently having resolved whatever preliminary assessment he had been running. "I've got 5 brothers," he offered. "You?" "None," Harry said. "Just, I live with my aunt and uncle, and their son." "Cousins are a bit different," Ron said in the tone of someone who had decided not to pursue this and was offering the decision as a kind of consideration. "They are," Harry agreed. The trolley came an hour into the journey, rattling down the corridor with its cargo of things Harry had never heard of. He bought a quantity of them with gold from the bag Hagrid had given him. Chocolate frogs and Bertie Bott's every flavor beans and a cauldron cake and something called a pumpkin pasty that was exactly what it said, and set them in the seat between them. Ron had sandwiches in a slightly crumpled paper bag that he ate alongside the sweets Harry handed him without making any particular thing of it, which Harry understood was its own kind of tact. Harry ate. He ate without the particular low-level monitoring he usually kept running. Was there enough? Was there more? Had he taken too much? He was careful. The habit was in his hands before it reached his head. The careful, small movements of someone trained by a long time of meals that were conditional, but he ate, and it was good, and no one was counting. Ron didn't comment on the careful. Harry was quietly grateful without examining why. They were somewhere past the 2nd hour, deep into chocolate frog cards, and an extended discussion of which Bertie Bott's flavors were worth attempting, when the door opened again, and a girl stood in it with a mass of bushy brown hair and the manner of someone crossing a task off a list. "Have you seen a toad? A boy called Neville's lost his somewhere on the train." "No," said Harry. "No," said Ron. She came in anyway. She had already decided to, Harry thought. The question had been a formality. She sat down and looked them both over with the quick, systematic assessment of someone who was used to forming accurate first impressions and trusted her own. "I'm Hermione Granger," she said. "Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter." The pause she gave this was brief, but present. "I've read about you," she said, with the directness of someone who considered information to be a neutral fact. "In Modern Magical History and a few others. My parents are Muggle dentists, so I had to do quite a lot of research when I got my letter. I've read all of our textbooks already, actually." She said this without apology and without boastfulness, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had done a thing because it needed doing and did not require a particular response to it. "All of them?" Ron said. "Cover to cover." She looked at his wand, which was still out from the practice he'd been demonstrating earlier. "Is that a 7-layer wrap on the handle? The core looks a bit worn. You might have some calibration trouble in practical work." "It was my brother's," Ron said. Hermione said, in the tone of someone filing this away as relevant data. She turned to Harry. "Have you tried any spells yet?" "No. I've been practicing a few non-verbal applications, though technically we're not supposed to attempt wand work before enrollment. Still." She squared her shoulders very slightly, a gesture that seemed to mean that technically and still were both things she had thought about and reached conclusions on. "Transfiguration is what I'm most looking forward to. Professor McGonagall, she's head of Gryffindor. I understand she's very precise." "I don't know what house I'll be in," Harry said. "None of us do yet." She said this with the slight edge of someone who found uncertainty correctly identified to be much more manageable than uncertainty ignored. "Though I'd like to be in Gryffindor, all the best people from what I've read." Ron said. "My whole family have been Gryffindors," in a tone that suggested this was simultaneously a point of pride and a burden he had already been carrying his entire life. The train slowed as the mountains outside went properly dark. They changed into their robes. Harry in the corridor, self-conscious, trying not to be in anyone's way, and when they pulled into Hogsmeade Station and came out onto the cold platform to the sound of a lamp and a familiar enormous voice calling "Furs years, this way," Harry felt something loosen slightly in his chest at the sight of Hagrid's outline against the dark. He followed the cluster of first years down a steep path to the lake's edge, where boats were waiting in a row on the black water, and climbed into one with Ron and Hermione and another boy who hadn't said anything yet, and the boats moved off across the lake without anyone rowing them, which seemed to Harry like exactly the sort of thing that would happen here. Then the person next to him said quietly, "Look," and Harry looked up. The castle was above the lake, and it was lit, and it was enormous in the way that things were enormous whose edges you hadn't yet found. Light poured from windows that went up in towers that went up into a sky full of stars. He looked at it and kept looking and did not find anything in particular to think, which was unusual for him. He was a person who usually had quite a lot to think in every available moment. But there was nothing here except the light on the water and the dark and the castle, and he looked at it without thinking for a long time. The boats reached the shore. He was still looking when his feet found solid ground. The ceiling was open to the sky. That was the first thing Harry thought when McGonagall led them through the double doors into the Great Hall, that the ceiling wasn't there, or rather that it was there but transparent or something, because above the hundreds of floating candles, the night sky stretched out in all its depth, black and star-scattered and very real. He could feel the cold of it almost. He kept looking up at it while he was supposed to be walking. "It's bewitched," Hermione said quietly beside him, apparently because she could see him doing this. "To look like the outside sky. It says so in Hogwarts, a history." Harry looked at it for another moment. He found it somehow more extraordinary that it was a performance than that it might have been real. Someone had made this. Someone had looked at a ceiling and decided it should be a sky, and then had made it so, and then for however many centuries it had been a sky, and the people eating underneath it had looked up at stars while they were inside. He didn't know what to do with this information except to file it as evidence that the world he was entering had a completely different relationship to beauty than the one he was leaving. 4 long tables ran the length of the hall, packed with students. The staff sat at a raised table across the far end, watching the first years file in with the varied expressions of people who had watched this happen many times and found it varying degrees of interesting. At the center of the staff table, a tall woman with square spectacles and her black hair pinned severely under her pointed hat watched the procession with the absolute composed attention of someone who had very precise things in mind. Harry recognized the attention. He had only seen it once before, from the outside, from Hagrid, in a pub, looking at him. A stool stood at the front of the hall with an old hat on it, grubby, patched, the brim curled from some long-ago wear. Harry looked at it. It looked like something you would find at the back of a wardrobe and not know why you were keeping. Then it twitched at the brim, and the patched surface near the brim opened, and it sang. He watched the song more than he heard it. He was watching the hat and thinking about the fact that it had been doing this, whatever this was, for a very long time, and when it was done, it fell silent again, and McGonagall unrolled a scroll and began to read names. There were 37 of them. Harry stood very still in the line of nervous first years and did not particularly think about his own name approaching, because he had discovered that this was the more manageable way to handle things that were approaching. Longbottom Neville. A round-faced boy made his way to the front, plump, a little pale, clutching something in his pocket with the focused grip of someone holding a talisman. The hat went on, and there was a pause, and then the hat shouted, "Gryffindor," and the table on the left erupted, and Neville went to sit there with the expression of someone who had not quite believed this would happen and was revising his expectations accordingly. Harry waited. Names came and went. The hall grew quieter as the stools filled. Potter, Harry. He was moving before he had decided to move, which was usual. His body had learned to respond to names and tones of authority with a speed that his thinking hadn't caught up with. He walked to the front, sat on the stool, and the hat came down over his eyes, and the great hall disappeared, and there was nothing but darkness and a very old voice speaking directly to him. "Well," said the hat. "Now here is something." Harry sat very still. I have been doing this for 993 years, the hat said, in the tone of something that found this neither remarkable nor tiresome, simply accurate. I have sat on rather a lot of heads. I have sorted the frightened and the arrogant and the brilliant and the cruel, the ones who came in knowing precisely who they were and the ones who were hoping to find out. I have sat on the heads of children who were carrying secrets, and children who were carrying ambitions, and children who were carrying the weight of their families like furniture. I know the shape of most things before they begin. Harry did not say anything. He was not sure he was supposed to. But you, said the hat, are interesting. It was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant something was happening in a direction Harry couldn't see. Most children who come to me frightened know they are frightened. They can identify the fear as fear because they have a comparison, some memory of safety from which the current moment departs. You, the hat said, do not come to me frightened in that way. You come to me, cautious, watchful, with a very good internal catalogue of where the exits are. And you don't read this as fear because it is the most normal thing you have ever felt. It has simply been the weather. Harry was beginning to understand that the hat did not need him to confirm things. It was simply reading. Now, here is the question I always ask. The hat said, where do you belong? And the answer is usually something the child already knows, underneath the wanting, and my job is to say it. Slytherin would take you, the hat said thoughtfully. You are not without ambition. You have been managing a hostile environment since before you could read. That is a kind of cunning, though you would not call it that. And Ravenclaw is there. You are curious. You look at things until you understand them. You watch the ceiling, wondering who decided a ceiling should be a sky. A pause. But there is a thing I have rarely seen in 993 years, the hat said, and I want to name it before I name your house, because I think someone should. I have sat on the heads of brave children. I have sorted them for nearly a millennium. Courage comes in many shapes. The courage of conviction, of loyalty, of ferocity, of stubbornness, of joy. I know them all. What I have rarely sat on the head of is a child who does not yet know that what was done to him was something wrong. Harry felt something go very still inside him. Not the careful stillness he performed for other people. Something different, something that didn't have a performance in it. Most children, the hat said, who have been frightened, who have been made small, who have been given the leavings and the cast-offs and the remainder, most of them know in some corner of themselves that this was not what should have been. They carry the injustice as injustice, even if they cannot name it. It makes them angry, or it makes them grieving. It becomes a scar that they know they have. You have carried it as simply what is, as the texture of life, not as an exception to it. And this means your bravery has not been bravery in any form you would recognize. You were not brave in spite of the 10 years. You were shaped by them into someone for whom fear is simply weather and endurance is simply the shape of a Tuesday. You have never been given the option of cowardice, the hat said quietly. Cowardice requires that a safer path exist and be chosen over the harder one. You were never given a safer path. That is not the same as courage. But it is not the same as the absence of it either. And what I see, underneath all the careful and all the watchful and all the keeping track of exits, is something that chose this July to answer a question honestly that it did not know was remarkable to be asked. That let itself be known by one person for one moment without knowing whether that was safe. That is the beginning of something, the hat said. I have been sorting children for 993 years. I know the beginning of something when I sit on it. It was quiet for a moment. Not Slytherin then, the hat said, and there was something in the way it said it that was not quite humor and not quite gravity, but somewhere between the two. Better be Gryffindor. The hat was lifted from his head. The great hall came back all at once. The candles, the ceiling, the 4 tables, the faces. The Gryffindor table was applauding, loudly, some of them standing. And when his name had been called, the applause had taken on a particular quality that Harry had encountered before in the Leaky Cauldron and did not have a category for. He walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the table. He did not know where to put his hands. He did not know what face to make in response to being wanted. He had not had, in 11 years, enough practice to know what the appropriate thing was. And so he sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the table and waited for something else to happen that he would know how to respond to. Across the hall, at the staff table, Minerva McGonagall was watching him. She had watched him come through the door. Small for his age, dark hair, glasses with tape on the bridge, wearing the robes of a school that had been waiting for him since before he could walk. She had watched him look up at the ceiling, the way she suspected he had looked at everything this evening, with the concentrated wonder of a child who had not been given a great deal to wonder about. She had watched him stand in the line with the particular quality of stillness she had identified from Hagrid's description, and she had watched the hat take longer than usual on his head, and she had read nothing in his face while it deliberated because his face gave nothing away. She watched him sit at the Gryffindor table and fold his hands and look at the surface of it, and she saw the moment the applause reached him like something physical and he did not know what to do with it. She noted this. She noted it specifically and without abstraction, the way she had made a mark in the margin of his name on the class list, not as a category, but as a particular boy who was sitting at the table she headed and did not know, yet, how to receive uncomplicated warmth from people who meant it. That, she thought, was something she could do something about. Not all at once and not dramatically and not in a way that would embarrass him, but slowly, reliably, in the way that things got built, the same way that the boy had apparently built himself, out of necessity, over time. She could build something here, too. It was slower than undoing what had been done. It was the only tool she had. McGonagall turned back to her list. There were more names to be read. He had been making this preparation for 11 years. Not consciously. He had not stood before a mirror with the speech, had not drafted and revised, had not planned it with any of the formal care he brought to lesson plans or potion sequences. It had accumulated, rather, the way certain things accumulated in a man who did not let himself think about them, quietly, in the background of everything else, in the years since James Potter's son had been named and wept over and carried off to wherever orphaned children were kept while the rest of the world recovered from what their fathers had done. What Severus Snape had accumulated, over 11 years, was a taxonomy. He had catalogued every gesture James had ever used as a weapon against him. The arm thrown around the right person's shoulder, the quality of amusement on a face that always found something to be amused by, the expectation of welcome that never needed to be asked for because it was simply there, like weather, like the assumption of breathable air. He had built the taxonomy carefully and had added to it over the years the way a man might add to a case he was preparing, and he had known with complete precision what he would see when he finally looked at the face that wore James Potter's hair in James Potter's version of the world. The arrogance first. The ease of a boy raised on legends of himself. The particular quality of someone who had been told, from before he could remember being told, that the world's attention was a natural and correct thing and that he occupied the correct center of it. Snape had seen it in dozens of first-year students over the years. The ones from famous families, the ones whose names were known before they arrived. They moved through a room differently. Their shoulders were placed differently. They looked at the people around them as if the people were features of a landscape they had already decided to enjoy. He was ready for this. He had been ready for this for 11 years. He was, if he was honest with himself in the way that only the empty dungeon permitted, looking forward to it. The dungeons in the first week of September had the temperature they maintained from October through June. Not cold enough to be uncomfortable to a person who was accustomed to it, which Snape was, cold enough to be clarifying. The torches burned along stone that had been absorbing their smoke since the castle's founding, and the shelves along the eastern wall held their jars in the precise order he had assigned them on the first day of his appointment and not adjusted since. The preserved specimens in their solutions had the particular look of things that had been in one place long enough to have become part of it. The room was his, in the specific way that a room became a person's, through sustained occupation, through the accumulation of the decisions he had made in it, through the particular quality of silence it had learned to hold in the years since he had been the one making the silence. He stood at the front of it and waited. This, too, was a choice he had made intentionally, not to be behind the desk when the first years arrived, but to be standing in the open space before it, visible, not surrounded by anything. It produced consistently a particular quality of attention from a first-year class. He had refined this over 2 decades. The door opened, the Gryffindors and Slytherins filed in together the way first years did, in a loose, uncertain formation, spreading into the space and then clustering at its edges, trying to read the room before committing to it. Some of them he had already assessed from the sorting. The blonde Malfoy boy had the family posture, the particular way of holding the spine that his father had, and which Snape noted without any particular feeling about it. The Granger girl had the forward lean of someone for whom every new room was primarily a source of information. Several others he had not formed views of yet. He saw Harry Potter come in at approximately the third group through the door because he had been watching for him. For 3 seconds he saw only the size of him and said nothing. He had known intellectually, had known since July 1980, that the boy was a child and therefore small in the way that children were small. What he had not accounted for was the particular quality of the smallness. It was not the smallness of a child who was simply not yet grown, whose proportions were temporary and would resolve into someone's expectations of them. It was the smallness of someone who had spent time in conditions that made smallness a survival strategy. James Potter had never been small in his life. James had taken up room with the ease of someone to whom room was simply available, but the figure that crossed the threshold of the potions classroom wore school robes with the unconscious adjustment of a person who had dressed for years in things that did not quite fit, and walked into the room in a way that suggested the first piece of information he was gathering was where all the exits were. Harry Potter looked around the dungeon once with a quick, particular sweep, and then chose a seat in the second row, middle section. Not at the front, not at the back. The seat of a person who had spent a long time trying not to be noticed without looking as though they were trying not to be noticed. Snape filed this observation in the part of his mind he used for things that had not yet found their proper category, and began the lesson. He walked them through the terms of it with the pace he had developed over the years, deliberate enough to be followed, brisk enough to establish that he was not waiting for them. Precision was what they would learn in this room, if they learned anything. Precision in measurement, in observation, in language. The difference between 2 degrees of temperature and 20 could mean the difference between a solution that worked and a room that required structural repair. He did not speak to them as though they were children. He never did. They would either rise to the level of the address, or they would not. He let the room settle into itself and turned his attention to the second row. Potter. The boy looked up. Snape looked at the scar. The scar was exactly what he had been told it was. A lightning bolt shape on the forehead, acquired in the course of the only genuinely remarkable thing James Potter had ever accomplished, which was dying in front of his wife so that she could die in front of their son and create a magical protection that had nothing to do with James and everything to do with Lily. Snape looked at the scar for slightly longer than was necessary for identification purposes, and then looked at the space slightly above the boy's eyes. "What?" he said. "Would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The boy was still. Not the stillness of a student composing an answer, accessing knowledge, running through what they had read. The particular practiced stillness of someone who had been addressed by authority with a tone suggesting that incorrect responses would have consequences, and who had learned, by long repetition, the most efficient response to that kind of address. Wait, say as little as possible, do not volunteer information that might be the wrong information. "I don't know," Harry Potter said. That was it. Nothing after it, no apology, no elaboration, no performance of regret. Certainly nothing that resembled the cheerful confidence with which James had always delivered his ignorance, as though ignorance was simply one of his more charming qualities. He said, "I don't know," and stopped, and looked at Snape with the expression of someone who was waiting to see what would happen next, and had no particular opinion about it yet. James had always had an opinion. Snape moved on. "Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "I don't know." "The same." "And what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" From the front row, Hermione Granger said, apparently to herself, that they were the same plant. Snape awarded Gryffindor 5 points in the tone he reserved for technically correct answers delivered at the wrong time, in the wrong manner, and told Harry Potter that he would benefit from consulting his textbooks before their next lesson, rather than relying on his classmates. The boy wrote something in his notebook, small and precise, and said nothing. The practical element of the lesson was introductory, a simple preparation designed less to teach than to establish what he was working with. Over 21 years he had learned that what a first year did with their first cauldron told him nearly everything he needed to know about the shape of the work ahead. He distributed the equipment without ceremony and moved among the benches while they began. He reached the second row, middle section, and stopped. Harry Potter was measuring. This was not, in itself, unusual. The unusual part was the method. Most first years approach their first set of measuring scales as you would approach any new object, with the assumption that you began at the amount you thought you needed and corrected from there. You could tell, with long practice, the students who had never measured anything and were simply guessing from the students who had some domestic experience of cooking or chemistry and the students who had been coached at home and knew the terms but not yet the physical sensation of working with them. There was a shape to each kind of inexperience, and Snape had learned them all. Harry Potter was beginning with too little of everything and adding fractions. He was not taking a generous portion and scraping back toward the correct amount. He was not beginning at the correct amount and checking twice. He was taking a careful, insufficient quantity first, as though to take too much were the thing to avoid rather than the correct amount being the thing to reach for, and then calibrating up from there, adding tiny increments, watching the scale, adding again. His attention to the scale was the attention of someone who had learned that using too much of something risked leaving too little, and that running out was the thing you were really managing against. This was not a potions error. This was a different kind of error entirely, which was not, strictly speaking, an error at all. It was simply a pattern of management imported from some other context where the pattern had been accurate, and Snape could see the shape of the context clearly enough, and chose, at that specific moment, to walk to the next bench. He did not write anything down. He said nothing. He moved on and observed the Malfoy boys' fussy over-precision and the Granger girls' meticulous textbook-derived accuracy and the Weasley boys' determined competence that clearly owed a great deal to watching family members do this before him. And at the end of the lesson, when the first years had filed out with the specific relief of people who had survived a thing they had been warned about, he remained. He stood in the empty room for a while before he began the tidying up. He did this at the start of every year. He had not examined why. He thought about Lily. He thought about her with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years learning to think about her in ways that did not cause him to stop functioning, not about the loss, not about the rupture, not about the last time she had looked at him on a corridor and known, correctly, that she was done. He thought about her the way you filed a fact. She had had brilliant green eyes, and her son had inherited them exactly, and Snape had not looked at them once during the lesson. This had been intentional. He had known, in the way you knew something you had been careful not to examine directly, that if he looked at Harry Potter's eyes, he would see Lily looking back at him from a face that was otherwise James, and that this was a combination for which he had no prepared response, and would not have one today. He had looked at the scar, at the forehead, at the hands on the measuring scales, at the specific, too careful grip of a boy holding an object as though he was not entirely certain it was permitted to him. He had looked at all of it except the eyes. He would look at them when he had decided what to do with them. He had not yet decided. He could not, in the silence of the empty potions room, reconcile the template with what the first lesson had actually produced. He had expected arrogance and found its opposite, a boy who took up as little space as possible, who chose the middle seat, who said, "I don't know," without apology or embellishment, who measured ingredients from insufficient upward as though abundance were a thing to be managed carefully rather than expected. Every piece of it was the wrong shape for James. None of it was explained by the boy being famous or by a childhood spent being told he was remarkable. Famous children did not sit in the middle. Snape gathered his papers. He had a meeting in the early evening and a pile of third-year essays he had been declining to read since the previous Friday. The discrepancy lodged in its corner of his mind and waited. He did not invite it to stay. It stayed anyway, in the way that things did when they had no proper category yet and were declining to be filed under the provisional label he had assigned them. He had called it James, had been calling it James for 11 years, and he was going to continue calling it James until he had sufficient reason not to, which he did not yet have, and which he was for the moment not looking for. He was a man who, by long professional habit, preferred the facts he already had to the facts he might find if he looked more carefully. He closed the door of the potions classroom behind him. Down the corridor, the torch at the corner of the passage threw his shadow long and black against the stone. She watched him work and tried to be precise about what she was seeing. This was her method, and she applied it to Harry Potter the way she applied it to everything she was determined to understand correctly. Strip the category away, refuse the general, stay with the particular. Not Harry Potter the famous, not Harry Potter the difficult, not Harry Potter the symbol of something she had failed to prevent. Only this boy, age 11, sitting in the third row of her transfiguration classroom in mid-October with a matchstick in his hand, attempting to turn it into a needle. He was not her best student. That was the Granger girl, who had clearly read not only the assigned text but several others and was conducting what appeared to be a private comparative analysis even while her matchstick was already developing its point. Harry Potter was somewhere in the solid middle, attentive in a way that several of his classmates were not, capable of following an instruction through to its conclusion, but not yet fluent, not yet natural. His wand work was careful rather than instinctive. He thought before he moved. He was someone who, she suspected, had spent a long time thinking before moving at the cost of the other children's instinct, which was to move first and see what happened. What she was specifically watching was what he did when he got something right. He had not yet had the result clearly enough to notice it himself. The matchstick's surface had shifted along 1/3 of its length, gone from wood grain to something approaching gray metal, and stopped there, incomplete, hovering. In most students, this partial result produced a sound, a small exclamation, a turn to the person beside them, some form of external verification. Harry Potter looked at it for a long moment, alone, and made an assessment of his own. Whatever that assessment concluded, he filed it internally and went back to work without anyone else's input. He had not looked to Weasley on his right or to anyone on his left. He had evaluated the outcome on its own terms and moved on. McGonagall noted this, the very efficient internal mechanism of a boy who had learned that the only reliable evaluation of a result was the one he conducted himself, because no one else was running one for him. She moved on. The lesson continued. She corrected 3 errors and awarded 2 points and walked the room with the particular quality of attention that her students described to each other, she was well aware, as frightening. It was not frightening. It was simply complete. She gave the room every part of her attention, and some of her attention was always on the boy in the 3rd row. At the end of the lesson, when the students were packing up, Harry Potter's matchstick fell off his desk. He reached for it, quickly, the fast automatic reach of someone accustomed to catching things before they were lost, and knocked his ink bottle as he did it. The bottle rocked. He caught it with his other hand. The matchstick hit the floor. He looked at the matchstick on the floor and then up, not at her, not yet. At the space between himself and the nearest person, the way someone looked when they were calculating how much of what had just happened was visible to everyone else. His face had the brief quality of someone bracing. McGonagall said, in the voice she used for practical corrections, "Pick it up, and we'll take the result as partial credit for the lesson. You've got a good 1/3 of the way there." He looked at her. She met his gaze and held it for exactly a beat longer than was strictly necessary. She wanted him to hear, "This is a classroom. Things fall. They are picked up. You are not in trouble for them." He picked up the matchstick. "Thank you," he said, which was more than most 11-year-olds managed when unexpectedly given partial credit. He put the matchstick in his bag and left. She stood at the front of her classroom after the students had gone and thought about what she was doing and whether it was adequate, and decided, as she had been deciding with increasing frequency over the 6 weeks since term began, that watching was no longer sufficient and she needed to go upstairs and say so to someone. Dumbledore's office was lit with more of its instruments than usual when she arrived. She hadn't sent a message ahead, a deliberate choice, and he did not appear surprised to see her. He was standing at his window looking out at the grounds. The October dark had come down early. The lake was a black surface below, and the forest was its own darkness beyond that. He turned when she came in. His half-moon spectacles caught the lamplight. "Minerva," he said. She sat down. She had thought on the way up the stairs about how to begin, whether to approach it indirectly, as she might approach it with a colleague she was uncertain of, or directly, as she had always preferred but had learned, over many years of working alongside this particular man, required a certain accuracy of aim. A direct approach with Albus Dumbledore that was even slightly imprecise gave him something to redirect gently toward, and by the time he had finished being gentle, you were somehow no longer discussing the thing you had come to discuss. She said, "I've been watching Harry Potter for 6 weeks." "I know," Dumbledore said. "He is going to be all right," she said, with the careful precision of someone who had spent 3 days deciding on the exact words. "He is a sensible child, and he has more capacity than I expected. More than he should have to have." She let the air in the room hold this for a moment. "I want to ask you something I should have asked in 1981. He sat down then. He folded his hands. His blue eyes, behind the half-moon spectacles, were attentive in the way they were always attentive when he was listening with all of himself. In the years between 1981 and this September, she said, did you ever look for a way to hold the blood protection intact while also improving the conditions the child was living in? The silence was brief. Yes, Dumbledore said. At length. And? The protection runs through Petunia, through blood. But more than that, it runs through Harry's belief, his genuine belief that her house is his home. The magic does not require him to be happy there. It does not require him to be treated well. It requires only that he regard it, in some functional sense, as the place where he belongs. He looked at his hands. If Harry were given something sufficient, something genuinely better, the belief would shift. He would know, in the way that children know things about where they belong, that he belonged to the better place, and not to Privet Drive. And if he knows that, the protection fails. What Voldemort would do, given that opportunity, is not a calculation I was willing to make. McGonagall listened to all of this, and when it was finished, she said, so it was designed to require his suffering. Dumbledore did not contradict her. The magic is Lily's, he said. She created it. She did not design it to require suffering. What it required was that he have a home, and I chose the home that would hold, the blood relative, the fixed address, the most durable anchor. The suffering was the Dursleys' contribution to the arrangement. I did not design the suffering, but I chose the structure, and the structure permitted it. And I have been aware of that distinction and of how thin it is for 10 years. Thin, she said. Yes. He met her gaze directly. Thin. The fire in the grate settled. One of the silver instruments on the shelf completed a slow revolution and began another. McGonagall stood. She had not come here expecting resolution and had not received any, which was the intended outcome of conversations with Albus Dumbledore when he was in possession of a reason that she could not, in good conscience, argue was insufficient. She could not argue that keeping Harry alive was insufficient. She could only tell him that she had heard him and that she was not satisfied, and let him carry the precise weight of her not being satisfied back into whatever he did with it. I'll be watching him, she said. You should know that. I would expect nothing else. She went back down the stairs. She had a set of second-year essays waiting, and she had, somewhere in the morning's post, a note from a parent that required a reply she had been composing in her head since Tuesday. There was work. What she did in the weeks that followed was small and deliberate, a correction offered in the tone of instruction rather than reproof, a question directed at him when he looked as though he had noticed something but wasn't certain he was allowed to say so. A moment in the corridor in late November when he was carrying a stack of books that were slightly too many for his arms, and she took the top two without comment and walked with him to the staircase and handed them back. He said thank you, with the slight additional quality of someone who had not been expecting the thing they were thanking you for, and went up the stairs. She could not undo the decade. She had not been able to undo it in 1981, and she could not undo it in the first term of 1991. And the honest version of the thing she was doing in the small moments was not undoing it, was simply refusing to add to it, was making one corner of the world, specifically this one, specifically inside the castle she had spent her entire adult life in service of, a place where the boy was not invisible. It was not enough. She was aware of this. She did not allow herself to call it enough, because she had seen what 11 years of enough looked like, and she was not going to make that particular mistake twice. What she called it, instead, was the thing she could do, and she did it. The castle at Christmas was a different country. Harry had known in the abstract that he was looking forward to staying. He had been counting the days since mid-November, since it had become clear that remaining here was a real possibility and not something that would be vetoed before he could reach it. But the abstract had not prepared him for the specific, 12 enormous Christmas trees in the Great Hall, decorated with live fairies that flickered warm and gold against the stone, suits of armor in the corridors that sang carols in approximately the right key, and the particular quality of the castle when most of its students had gone, which was not the quality of emptiness, but of depth. It revealed itself differently without the terms traffic of bodies and noise and organized movement. The corridors had turns he hadn't yet found time to investigate. The staircases moved differently when no one was arguing with them. The Great Hall, at Christmas dinner with 8 remaining Gryffindors and a scattering of others from the other houses, and the teachers at their table, felt less like a refectory and more like a room someone had loved for a long time and continued to tend. Ron was at the other end of the table, deep in a conversation about Quidditch with a pair of older Gryffindors whose names Harry hadn't yet learned. Harry ate without monitoring himself. He had stopped noticing when he'd started to do this, somewhere in the first weeks of term, the way you stopped noticing the absence of something once it had been absent long enough. He ate, and the fire crackled in its grate across the hall, and the fairies blinked in and out of the trees, and nobody told him to stop. Hermione had gone home to her parents. Ron was here because Arthur and Molly Weasley had gone to Romania to visit Charlie, and Ron had chosen Hogwarts over spending Christmas with an aunt who, as he had described her to Harry on the last night before term's end, made a hobby of pinching his cheeks and calling him gnomish. Harry had not asked further about the aunt. He understood the principle. He found the mirror on the third night of the holidays, following a wrong turn in the fourth-floor corridor. He had been restless in a way that didn't have a name, not unhappy, not worried, simply not quite settled enough for sleep, and he had gotten up in the dark of the dormitory with the instinct that movement helped, and had taken his invisibility cloak from his trunk and walked. He had intended to go left at the fourth-floor landing. He went right instead and found himself at the end of a corridor he didn't recognize, facing a door that stood slightly open, and because an open door at the end of an unfamiliar corridor was difficult to argue with, he went through. The room was empty except for the mirror. It stood against the far wall, tall, taller than any mirror had a reason to be, framed in gold that had the elaborate quality of something made before anyone had learned to be restrained about it. Across its top, an inscription was carved into the frame: Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit onwosi. Harry did not stop to pass this. He stopped because he could see himself in it, himself, and also more. He was there, in the mirror, slightly taller, he thought. Or perhaps that was the standing straight that he was doing in the glass but not quite doing in the room, and around him were people. Not a crowd, not the Leaky Cauldron crowd or the Great Hall crowd, but specifically arranged people, close, the closeness of people who had that right. To his left was a woman with red hair and his exact eyes, brilliant green, looking at him with an expression he had no precise name for, because he had seen it only from a great distance before. An adult, looking at a child and having the child be the reason the adult was glad. To his right was a man with jet-black hair, in exactly the disorder Harry's own hair was in every morning, wearing glasses, slightly too tall for his own center of gravity, and he had his hand on Harry's shoulder with the casual certainty of someone for whom this was simply what hands did, where they naturally went when this particular person was nearby. There were others behind them further back, faces he couldn't quite resolve, a sense of populated depth. Harry stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He was not aware of deciding how long to stand there. He came back the next night. He came back the night after that as well, and stood there in his invisibility cloak. He had not taken the cloak off in front of the mirror, some instinct making him keep it, keep the option of disappearing, and looked at the red-haired woman with his eyes and the man with his hair, and felt the particular quality of the wanting, which was not new, exactly. He had known since July what his parents looked like, in the general. He had known their names. But knowing and seeing were not the same country, and the mirror offered something that no description had, the woman and the man at that specific proximity, that specific arrangement of closeness, which was not information, but was the other thing. On the third night, Dumbledore was already there. He was sitting in a chair beside the mirror in the posture of a man who had expected to be waiting and was satisfied with the wait. He was not wearing his usual robes. He had, Harry thought, the look of someone who had come from bed more recently than from his office. His silver beard lay across the front of his dressing gown, and his half-moon spectacles were pushed slightly up his nose. He was not looking at the mirror. "Harry," he said, "I've been wondering when you'd come back." Harry took off his cloak. He didn't see the point of the pretense. And in any case, Dumbledore seemed to be the kind of person who had already accounted for whatever you were going to try. "You know about the mirror," Harry said. "I do. It has been here, in this room, for a specific reason, this year, and I moved it to this room with full knowledge that someone who needed it might find it. I expected, if I am honest, that it might be you." He gestured with the kind of unhurried hospitality that suggested the floor in front of the mirror was entirely Harry's to stand on. "Sit down if you like, or stand. I've found it doesn't much matter for this particular conversation." Harry sat on the floor cross-legged. It was what he would have done anyway. "What does it do?" Harry said. Because this was what you did with Dumbledore, he had found. You asked the question, and you received an answer that was not deflected, but was careful in a different way. Dumbledore looked at the mirror now. In the glass, Harry could see the reflection, the crowded warmth of it, the red-haired woman and the man with familiar hair. But Dumbledore's reflection was simply Dumbledore, an old man in a chair, looking at himself. "The mirror of Erised," Dumbledore said, "shows us the deepest and most desperate desire of our hearts. The inscription, if you read it in a mirror, says, 'I show not your face, but your heart's desire.' Nothing you see in it is real in the ordinary sense. It is not a vision of the future or of something you might have. It shows only what you most want. And men have wasted away before it, not knowing if what they see is real or even possible." Harry thought about this. He had thought about it, in some form, on both previous nights. The question of whether the mirror was lying or simply showing him something that was true but inaccessible. "It doesn't tell you if you can have it," Harry said. "No, it does not do that. The mirror has no interest in what is possible or achievable or wise. It has only the one function, to reflect the want." Harry looked at the glass. Lily Potter's eyes looked back at him from the face of a woman who was looking at him with gladness. "What do you see?" Harry said. "When you look in it." Dumbledore turned to look at the mirror. A pause. "I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks," he said, in the tone of someone delivering this information without irony. Harry considered this for a moment. "That's not," he said, and stopped. He started again. "I don't completely believe that." "A valid position," Dumbledore said, with the slight quality of someone who was both entertained and not offended. An old man's desires are rarely what he admits to. They sat for a moment. The mirror reflected them both. Harry cross-legged on the floor, the crowd of warm, familiar faces around him. Dumbledore in his chair, whatever was in Dumbledore's glass that Dumbledore was keeping. Harry found, sitting on the stone floor of a disused classroom in December, that he was not going to ask the next natural question. He was going to ask a different one. "Did you know," he said, "what it was going to be like at the Dursleys?" The room was very quiet. "When you left me there," Harry said. He said it without particular weight, in the way he had learned to say things that were factual but loaded, in the way Hagrid had taught him, without knowing he was teaching it, by asking a question and expecting a plain answer. "Did you know what it was going to be like?" Dumbledore was quiet for long enough that Harry had time to count the seconds and decide that Dumbledore was choosing the precise shape of an honest answer, not whether to give one. "I knew that your aunt and uncle were not kind people," Dumbledore said. "I knew that the home would not be warm in any of the senses that matter for a child. I did not know about the cupboard. I did not know about the birthday cakes or their absence." He folded his hands in his lap. "What I knew was that it was the only place where the protection Lily's love had built around you would hold. The magic required that you have a home, a blood anchor, a genuine one. Petunia was the last blood Lily had. If I had placed you somewhere else, somewhere better, the protection would have been built on a foundation that Voldemort could walk through." "So you knew it would be bad," Harry said. "You didn't know how bad." "Yes," Dumbledore said. This was not a deflection. This was acknowledgement of exactly the distinction Harry had made, which Harry noted and filed as the thing adults rarely did. They slid off the specific instead of holding it. "Why didn't you check?" Harry said, not with anger, with the genuine inquiry of someone who wanted the factual answer. "After, in 10 years, why didn't anyone check?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Several reasons," he said, "that I examined carefully for a long time, and that were, in the moment, compelling. The secrecy surrounding your location, the need for the blood protection to hold without interference, the fact that the letters arrived, the Hogwarts letters, which the castle itself generates for every eligible child, and which told me each year that you were there and alive." He paused. "And also, and I will not pretend this is a small thing, Harry, the fact that if I had checked and found what Rubeus found on your birthday, I would have had to decide what to do about it. And I had designed a system that did not permit the obvious response." Harry sat with this. "You'd have had to choose between fixing it and keeping the protection," he said. "Yes. So you didn't look?" "I have thought about that," Dumbledore said. "Every day since Rubeus told me what you'd said. I expect I will continue to think about it." He did not say he was sorry. Harry understood, without being told, that the word sorry would be too small for this, and Dumbledore knew it. What Dumbledore was doing was something different. He was holding the thing, out in the open, in the space between them, and not asking Harry to accept any reduction of it. Harry looked at the mirror. He looked at the red-haired woman with his eyes, her eyes, looking at him, and the man with his hair, who had his hand on Harry's shoulder with the certainty of belonging, and the others behind them, the depth of a family he had never had. He was 11 years old. He did not have the language yet for everything he was doing with this information. What he had was the following. The most honest thing any adult had ever said to him in his entire life, said by the person who was most responsible for the thing that needed the honesty, and he had not been asked to feel better about it or to forgive it or to put it away somewhere convenient. He had simply been told, and the telling was the most respectful thing he could remember being given. After a while, Dumbledore stood and said that it would be best if Harry went to bed, and that the mirror would be moved before morning. Harry retrieved his cloak from where it had pooled on the floor beside him. He stopped at the door. "The woolly socks," he said. "Yes, I don't believe it, but I think it was a kind answer." He thought about it. "I mean, it was a kind thing to say instead of the real thing. Like you didn't want me to think about what you wanted, because then I'd think about you not having it." Dumbledore looked at him over his half-moon spectacles for a moment. "Go to bed, Harry," he said. There was something in his voice that Harry couldn't name exactly, but which had the sound of a very old man being surprised by something he had not expected to be surprised by. Harry went back up the stairs and got into bed and lay in the dark dormitory with Ron's quiet breathing across the room and did not return to the mirror, which was gone by morning as promised, and did not need to. The thing that had been bothering Harry since September became, by November, a specific shape. He had known about the third-floor corridor since the start of term. They all had. It was the first rule Dumbledore had given them at the opening feast, stated with the pleasant calm of someone giving you a direction that was also a warning. Do not go to the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side unless you wish to die a very painful death. Harry had taken this at face value, which was also the literal value, because the last few months had given him no particular reason to doubt that the castle meant what it said. He had passed the corridor several times in the ordinary course of being lost, and had noted the door and had not gone through it. But the thing he kept coming back to was the timing. He had been at Gringotts on the 31st of July, standing in the stone passage while Hagrid collected something small and grubby from Vault 713 and said Hogwarts business in the tone of a man who was not going to say anything further. And then, in September, the Daily Prophet had reported that Gringotts had been broken into, the same day, the same vault, and nothing had been found because the vault had already been emptied that morning. By someone. For Hogwarts business. Whatever was in Vault 713 was now inside the castle. And there was a locked corridor on the third floor that Dumbledore had mentioned with the specific gravity of a man who was telling you the prohibition was real. Harry had been turning this over since September. By November, it had become a certainty of a kind he couldn't prove but couldn't dismiss. Something was here. Something was being protected. And someone besides Dumbledore might be trying to get to it. He was still holding this as an unconfirmed theory when the Quidditch match happened, and his theory took on a more specific and immediate quality. He was 2 minutes into the match, scanning the pitch from 200 feet up for the golden glint of the snitch, when his broom lurched beneath him. Not the ordinary buck of a broomstick in turbulent air, something purposeful, something that wanted him off. It lurched again, harder, and he gripped the handle with both hands, and his hands were slipping and the broom was trying to throw him sideways, and below him the pitch was very far below, and the crowd had gone from cheering to a different kind of noise entirely. He hung on. The broom twisted, and he wrapped his legs around it, and it jerked again, and he could hear people screaming, and he thought, in the specific way he thought during extreme situations, with clarity rather than panic, that this was not a mechanical failure. Mechanical failures didn't have this quality of intention. He managed to pull himself back a stride. The lurching stopped as suddenly as it had begun. He caught the snitch 7 minutes later in the most unwilling dive of his life, his mouth closing around it so that the game ended before the game could have another go at him, and came down from the pitch with his hands still shaking slightly, in the particular fine tremor of someone whose body has been doing something frightening and is coming down from it. Hermione had run across the pitch to him with her robes slightly singed, which he learned, later, had happened when she had knocked over the wrong person while trying to break someone else's eye contact. The explanation confused him when she gave it. She pointed to Snape, up in the stands, who had been muttering with his eyes fixed on Harry's broom and had stumbled into a pair of Hufflepuffs when Hermione elbowed past him. Harry looked at Snape. Snape met his gaze across the distance of the pitch with the expression he always wore, which was not warm, and looked away. Harry thought about this for a long time afterward. He thought about it the way he thought about things that needed careful processing. Not with the first conclusion he reached, but with the first conclusion set aside while he checked it. He was, by now, a person who had spent a year learning that the first explanation was not always the correct one. McGonagall's even voice correcting his matchstick error had not been the attack he'd braced for. Dumbledore in the disused classroom had not been the deflection he'd expected. Things were sometimes different from the first shape they took. Snape had been looking at his broom. Snape disliked him in a way that Snape appeared to dislike everyone who wasn't a Slytherin. But Snape was also a teacher who had counter-cursed someone's broom during a Quidditch match last year, or so Percy Weasley had told Ron, who had told Harry in September. Snape knew counter-curses. Snape could have been muttering a counter-curse. Harry did not commit to Snape as the answer. He filed Snape as a visible person in the stands and kept looking. The question of who had been casting the jinx itself, he left open. In January, Hagrid's dragon turned out to be a problem of a more immediate kind. Ron was bitten. Norbert bit him on the hand with the efficient commitment of a dragon who had assessed the situation and found Ron the closest available target, and was in the hospital wing with a hand that had turned green and black in a series of alarming stages before Madame Pomfrey got to it. Harry and Hermione managed the problem at the astronomy tower on a dark night in early April. Norbert handed off to Charlie's friends from Romania, who took her in a large crate that she demolished from the inside within the first 20 minutes of the journey, according to the letter Charlie sent Hagrid 3 weeks later. Ron, still in the hospital wing, missed the handoff entirely. Harry found, standing on the astronomy tower with Hermione in the dark while wings beat away into the distance, that he was thinking about what it meant to move a creature that needed protecting to a place where it could be kept safely. There was a shape to that thought he recognized without having to name it. The detention came in May because someone had seen them on the astronomy tower. He and Hermione and Neville and Draco Malfoy were sent into the Forbidden Forest at 11 at night with Hagrid and a lantern, following a trail of silver unicorn blood that caught the light between the trees. Harry had been in the castle's grounds many times, but not in the forest itself, and the forest had a quality that the grounds didn't, a depth and a closeness, as though the trees were engaged in something you had interrupted. Hagrid sent them in pairs, Harry and Draco, Neville and Hermione. Draco bolted at the first sound he couldn't account for and fired sparks into the air to call Hagrid back, and Harry was alone when he saw the cloaked figure. It was crouched over the fallen unicorn at the edge of the path, a unicorn that was already still, silver and enormous on the ground, its blood pooled in the dark around it. The cloaked figure had its face down at the animal's flank, drinking, and the quality of the scene, the darkness, the blood, the specific attitude of the figure bent over the creature, made Harry's feet go cold before his mind had caught up. The figure lifted what might have been a face, or might have been the fold of a hood. Harry ran. He ran the way he ran when there was a sound in the house he couldn't account for, the particular running of someone who had learned that the most useful move was the one made before they were noticed. The centaur came from the trees to his left. He was large and silver-gray and appeared to have been watching from further back in the forest, with the specific unhurried composure of a being who operated on a different scale of time and urgency than Harry did. He lifted Harry onto his back without ceremony, as though this were a practical matter rather than an extraordinary one, and carried him back to the path where Hagrid and the others were waiting. Harry said nothing during the brief transit. He was still doing the running internally. Before he set Harry down, the centaur said, in the tone of someone delivering information they considered useful regardless of whether the recipient was prepared for it. Unicorn blood sustains a cursed life. Only something that has nothing to lose and everything to gain would slay a creature as innocent as a unicorn. That is the cost of it. A half-life, a cursed half-life, until something better can be found. He looked at Harry with the large dark eyes of an animal that was also, entirely, not an animal. Whatever is in this forest has been long gone from the living. It is managing for now on borrowed time. He walked back into the trees. Harry stood on the path with Hagrid and Hermione and Neville and Draco, who had found them from the other direction and was trying to look as though he hadn't recently been running, and thought about borrowed time and a cursed half-life and something that had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and about Vault 713 and the thing inside the third-floor corridor and the Gringotts break-in on the same day Hagrid had emptied the vault, and felt all of it arrive at a single point. Voldemort was not gone. He had known, in the abstract, that Voldemort had not been killed on the night his parents were. Hagrid had said as much in July. You-know-who tried to kill you and couldn't kill a baby, lost his powers. A man could lose his powers without losing his life. A man could manage on borrowed time, on a cursed half-life, until he found something better. The Philosopher's Stone made the elixir of life. The elixir kept a person alive indefinitely. If you were existing on borrowed time, the stone was worth doing the things that had happened in this forest tonight. Snape had been counter-cursing during the Quidditch match. Harry had kept that observation aside, unfiled, because it hadn't yet been useful. It was useful now. If Snape had been counter-cursing, someone else had been casting the jinx. The jinx on his broom had come from somewhere in the stands. He thought about the stands. He thought about who else had been there. He thought about defense against the dark arts, and a purple turban that smelled of garlic, and a stammer that appeared in public and didn't appear in the private moments Harry had glimpsed. Once, heading toward the third-floor corridor in the early weeks of term, Quirrell had walked past him in the wrong direction, with the bearing of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was going there purposefully, and the stammer had not been present in the set of the shoulders. He thought about July 31st. A young man in a purple turban who had shaken his hand in the Leaky Cauldron with everyone watching, had pumped it once, twice, and released it. A half-second too quickly, Harry had thought, without having anywhere to file the observation. He had a place for it now. A man who had lost his body, who was sharing someone else's, who carried Voldemort behind the wrap of his turban. A sustained skin contact with Harry's hand would have burned, had been burning, and had been released a half-second too quickly, because even a brief moment was already more than the person inside the turban could manage without showing it. It was Quirrell, the man with the stammer, the man who had shaken his hand on his birthday and looked at him with the frightened eyes Harry had read as ordinary nervousness, the man who had been in the Leaky Cauldron with everyone else that day, wishing him well, and who had been there for the same reason the stone was being sought, not to celebrate Harry, but to look at him, to be near him. Harry stood on the path with the others around him, and the forest was dark, and he knew. They went in the evening, when the corridor was empty, and the light through the castle's high windows had gone to the flat grey of a June dusk, and nobody stopped them, which Harry had not precisely expected, but had also not entirely discounted. The three-headed dog was asleep. It was sprawled across the trapdoor with the specific boneless sprawl of a very large animal in deep sleep, and from somewhere in the room, he couldn't see it, couldn't find the source. A music box sound wound down and stopped, the last few notes trailing off into the stone walls. The room smelled of warm animal and the particular mineral cold of deep earth. Three enormous heads shifted in sleep, timed slightly off from each other, the breathing of something too large to be fully synchronized with itself. Ron found the ring of the trapdoor while Harry and Hermione watched the heads. He pulled. The trapdoor opened, and the dark below it was complete. They dropped through. The fall was longer than Harry expected, and the landing was softer than it had any right to be. They hit something that caught them, enveloped them, held them, and Harry had a brief second of relief before the something began to tighten. It had the cold quality of plant matter, of something alive in a direction different from the direction he was used to, and it was tightening around his arms and legs with the specific, unhurried conviction of a thing that had evolved to do exactly this. "Don't move," Hermione said, with the specific authority of someone who had reached a correct conclusion and needed the information transmitted very quickly. "Struggling makes it worse. It's Devil's Snare. It needs dark and damp. Stop moving." Harry went still. Ron went still. The tendrils held for a moment and then, confused by the absence of struggle, loosened slightly. Light erupted from Hermione's wand, a clear white blaze, directed downward at the plant around them, and the Devil's Snare recoiled with the urgency of something that found light deeply offensive, and the three of them dropped through onto the stone floor below. Harry picked himself up. They kept moving. The next chamber was full of birds. He heard them before he saw them, a rushing sound that had the quality of wings but also of something less organic, a mechanical irregularity beneath the beating sound. The door on the far side of the chamber was locked. On the walls were mounted broomsticks, and floating above them, swooping and diving in the vaulted space, catching the torchlight on their wings, were hundreds of keys, all shapes and sizes, the wings growing from their shafts in different colors. The one he needed was the one that had already been used, a large silver key with bright blue wings, slightly bent from where it had been jammed into the door when someone had come through before them, and then flown free when the door had been pulled open and shut again. Harry took a broomstick off the wall. The grip was unfamiliar, not his, not calibrated to him, and he kicked off without waiting to get comfortable with it, which was the correct decision because getting comfortable was going to take longer than finding the key. The flock swarmed upward when he entered their space, the keys scattering and reforming in patterns that seemed half random and half intentional, their wings catching the torches below in glints and flashes that made tracking any single key nearly impossible. He found the pattern of it after 2 circuits. The bent wing key was moving differently from the others. Its trajectory was slightly erratic, compensating for the damaged wing in a way he could read if he watched the whole chamber rather than any one section of it. He let it move. He tracked without pursuing. He waited for the moment when the erratic path of the bent wing would bring it across the predictable path of the group below, and then he dove. He caught it. The lock turned, the door opened, and they ran through. The chest chamber was larger than any room had the right to be underground, and the pieces were already in position. Ron looked at the board for a long moment with the expression of someone who had been asked to do something difficult and was resolving, quietly, that they were going to do it correctly. He directed Harry to replace the bishop on the king's side, and Hermione to a castle, and took the knight himself, because the knight was the piece that was going to matter, and he knew it. They played. Harry understood the board, but did not understand chess well enough to see more than 3 moves ahead. Ron saw 7, and directed them quietly, and they were doing well. They were going to win. And then Ron said, "We're going to have to make a sacrifice," in the tone of someone stating a strategic fact rather than an emotional one. And Harry looked at the board and understood what he meant. "Ron, it's the only way through," Ron said. "Don't argue, we haven't got time." He looked at Harry directly. "You go forward and win this. That's the whole point." He turned his horse and rode it to the square that the opposing queen was going to take in 2 moves and sat there and waited. The queen took him. The white knight was knocked from the board with a force that sent Ron sprawling across the stone floor and lay still. Hermione made a sound. Harry took a step toward Ron and then stopped because Ron's chest was moving, and the way the knight had gone down suggested it had been a blow rather than worse, and Ron had known it would be a blow and had gone there anyway. Harry took the opposing king. Checkmate. The next chamber smelled of something burning and contained 7 bottles in a line and a wall of black flame on the far side and purple flame at the entrance through which they'd come. Hermione read the riddle on the piece of parchment beside the bottles with the concentrated focus of someone for whom this was the part she had been waiting for and worked through it in silence. And then she looked at Harry. "There's enough here for 2 people to go back," she said, 1 to go forward. She was already running the arithmetic of who. "The smallest bottle is the forward one." She held it out. "You go back," Harry said. "Get Ron." She held his gaze for a moment. He could see she was checking whether he was certain, and then accepting that he was. "Be careful," she said. "You too." He took the bottle, crossed through the purple flames with her, watched her take the one that would let her go back through the black, and then he faced the black fire and drank the forward potion, and felt it go cold through him, uncomfortably cold, the cold of something operating at the level of temperature he did not usually interact with, and walked through. The chamber beyond was lit with torches and contained the mirror of Erised, and it contained Quirrell. He had known it would be Quirrell. He had known since the forest, since the centaur's information about cursed half-lives and borrowed time, since he had placed the Quidditch match and the turban and the handshake in July in the same sequence and arrived at the answer. He had known. He had still not been prepared for the man in the torchlight without the stammer. Quirrell stood with his back to Harry and said, "I wondered whether I'd be meeting you here, Potter," in a voice Harry had not heard before. Clear, flat, precise, the voice of someone who had been saving their actual voice for a room with no audience. He turned. The turban was gone. He looked, without it, like a person who had been wearing someone else's costume all year and had finally taken it off. He was younger, seeming. He was not frightened. He began to unwrap the cloth at the back of his head. Harry did not look away. He had learned, over the last year, that looking away from the things that were frightening was not more useful than looking at them. It was only less informative. What was on the back of Quirrell's head was not, precisely, a face. It was chalk white and flat, and the nose was two slits rather than a nose, and the eyes were red and had the particular quality of eyes that were not seeing what was in the room so much as looking through the room at something else. The eyes found Harry. "Harry Potter," said a voice from the back of Quirrell's head. And the word Harry had a quality of possession in it, the way you said the name of something you considered yours. "How very much like your father you look. He died begging, you know." Harry held the stone in his hand. He had found it in the mirror, had stood before it, expecting to see what he had seen before, and found instead only himself, in his own pocket, and had felt something slide against his palm before he understood what it meant. The stone was his because he had wanted to find it, but not to use it. He held it at his side and looked at the face at the back of the head. "Give me the stone," Voldemort said. "Your mother died the same way," Quirrell said, from the front of the head, conversationally. "Screaming. They always scream." He said this as though it were a kind of gift, as though the information were something Harry would want. Harry understood that the intent was to take something away from him, to make the death a small thing, a common thing, to put it in a register of ordinary facts and remove from it the weight it had. He held it at its weight. He did not give the stone. Quirrell moved without warning, crossed the room faster than Harry had processed the intention, and seized him by the wrist. His hands were cold and dry, the hands of a man whose blood was not his own, running at the temperature of whatever was using him, and Harry felt the grip and thought, "This is it, this is the moment, run or fight or something." And then there was heat, not pain, not first. Heat, in the way that heat was different from burning, the way you felt it radiating before you felt the contact. It came from his own hands, from inside his own palms, outward. He looked down at Quirrell's fingers on his wrist, and the fingers were going, there was no better word for it, wrong. Blistering in the manner of a thing that had been placed against a surface it was not compatible with. Quirrell made a sound that was not the stammer and not the clear, flat voice. It was something from below both of them. Harry did not pull away. This was the thing that was different. In another version of this moment, he might have pulled away because that was what you did when something hurt, when something was wrong, when a situation had gone beyond the boundary of what you understood. The instinct to retreat from the thing that was causing damage was an old instinct and a sensible one, and in another year, with another year behind him, he might have taken it. But his hands were burning outward, not inward. The heat was not coming from Quirrell. It was coming from him, from something in him. And he had spent the last year learning for the first time, with halting and imprecise and slowly accumulated evidence, what it felt like when something was operating through him on the principle of genuine care. Hagrid in the pub, with his face doing the thing it had done, asking where he had been. McGonagall in the corridor, taking the top 2 books from his stack without comment and handing them back. Dumbledore on the stone floor of a disused classroom, saying, "I have thought about it every day since," and meaning it. He did not know the theory of what was happening in his hands. He knew the quality of it. The quality was the same. He grabbed back. He took Quirrell's hands in both of his and held on, and the heat built in the way that things built when you stopped managing their edges and let them go, and Quirrell screamed, fully, openly, the sound of something that had never expected to lose. And Harry felt the heat moving up through his own arms and into his chest, and his vision went white at the edges, and he did not let go. He did not pull away. He held on, and he held on, and he held on until the screaming stopped. Something tore. Not the room. The room was intact. Something in the air between one moment and the next. A quality of presence. Of something that had been and then was no longer. Something passed through him going out. A cold that went through rather than around. A cold with a direction and a destination that was not here. He heard, at great distance, a sound that might have been screaming and might have been the wind. He was lying on the floor. The torches were burning. Quirrell was not there anymore. The cloth he had been wearing lay on the ground, deflated. The mirror reflected Harry on the floor, and the empty room, and nothing else. The darkness came, and Harry let it. He woke to white light and the smell of something medicinal and Dumbledore sitting in a chair beside the bed. This was not, Harry understood hazily, the first time someone had sat beside him while he was horizontal and in a state he couldn't fully account for. Hagrid had been there, on the night of his birthday, in the hut on the rock, Hagrid filling the available space with his particular enormity, the birthday cake on the table, the beginning of the year that had led here. But Hagrid had been there for the birthday. Dumbledore was here for the aftermath, which was a different thing, and which Harry lay looking at for a moment before he said anything. "The stone," he said. "Destroyed," Dumbledore said. "I arrived in time to retrieve you, but not in time to do anything about the stone itself. It was the correct outcome." He folded his hands. "Nicholas Flamel and his wife will die in the coming weeks, as their stores of the elixir are exhausted. I spoke to Nicholas. He was at peace with it. At 665 years, he has had, as he told me, more than enough time to put his affairs in order." Harry thought about 665 years. He could not hold the number as a number. It became instead a quality, the quality of something that had been for so long it was simply part of the world, and then wasn't. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the hospital wing, which was ordinary and close and did not pretend to be anything else. "You'll want to know about your hands," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at them. They were bandaged from the wrists to the knuckles, clean white strips, and beneath the bandaging he could feel a distant ache that had the character of something waiting for the pain relief charms to wear off, rather than something resolved. "They'll heal," Dumbledore said. "Madame Pomfrey says the burns are moderate and she is confident." He paused, in the manner of a man selecting the next thing with care. "Harry, I want to tell you something about what happened down there. I told you, in December, a partial version of why your mother's love created the protection it did. I want to tell you now what that protection did." Harry waited. "When Quirrell touched you, when he grabbed you and you held on, the magic in your skin responded to the magic in his contact. He is carrying Voldemort. Voldemort murdered your mother, and in the moment of her murder she could have stepped aside and did not. And what she made in that refusal was the most durable protection magic knows how to make." Dumbledore looked at Harry's bandaged hands. "It lives in your skin. It has lived there since you were 15 months old, and when something that carries Voldemort touches you with sustained contact, the protection activates." Harry thought about the heat, not the pain. The heat that had come before the pain, the warmth that had moved outward from his palms as though it had somewhere to go and was going there. He thought about the quality of it, which had not felt like a weapon, which had felt like the other thing. "She left something of herself in me," Harry said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That is precisely what she did." Harry lay on the hospital wing bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the woman in the mirror with the red hair and the green eyes that were his eyes, and what it meant that she had been in his skin all along, doing the thing she had done before he was old enough to know she'd done it. He didn't say anything else about it. He filed it in the part of himself he was building for things that were too large for immediate language and waited to see what the next thing would be. Ron appeared the following morning, coming from the direction of his own bed 6 rows down the wing, walking with the careful gait of someone whose ribs had been introduced to a chess piece at high velocity and had not yet forgotten the meeting. He sat in the chair Dumbledore had sat in and looked at Harry with the frank, direct gaze he always used. "You look terrible," Ron said. "You don't look much better," Harry said. "That's fair." Ron put his hands on his knees. Hermione cried. "She's not here yet because she was determined not to cry in front of you, so she needed more time to stop. She's brought chocolates." Hermione arrived 20 minutes later, composed and carrying a box of Honeydukes Best with the purposefulness of someone who had decided that chocolate was the correct response to the situation. She sat on the other side of the bed and did not cry, which Harry understood had cost her something, and the 3 of them ate chocolates and said very little about anything that had happened below the trapdoor, because very little needed to be said. They had all gone through. That was the shape of it. They knew what the shape of it was. Gryffindor won the House Cup at the end of year feast. Dumbledore announced the point tallies with the particular quality of a man who had been waiting to deliver a piece of good news and was enjoying the architecture of the announcement. Last-minute points for chess strategy and scholarly merit and nerve in the face of extreme circumstances, awarded to Ron and Hermione and Harry and to Neville Longbottom, who had stood his ground on a different kind of difficult evening in a way that had mattered. The green Slytherin banners across the hall shifted to Gryffindor red. The hall was very loud. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table and listened to the noise and let himself take up room in it. Let himself be here, inside the sound of it, not at a distance from it. He had spent a year learning the difference. He was not there yet, not fully, but he was closer than he had been in September, and September felt like a long time ago in the way that the first day of something always felt like a long time ago at the end. He ate too much, which was new and fine. McGonagall found him in the corridor on the morning they were leaving, which was not, Harry had come to understand, an accident. She was carrying a sheaf of end-of-term papers, and she stopped in the manner of someone who had been coming in this direction for this purpose and had arranged to encounter him. "The Hogwarts Express leaves at 11, she said. "You'll want to be at the station by 10:30. "Yes," Harry said. "I know." She looked at him for a moment in the way she had looked at him all year. The look that was not soft exactly but was specific, that had him in it rather than around him. "You know where to write," she said, "if you need anything, over the summer." He understood that this was not the excuse, and that the train time had been the excuse. He understood what she was actually saying, and the precision with which she was saying it, which was that she knew what summer was, and she wanted him to know she knew, and that he could write. "Thank you," he said. She gave him one more moment of the look and then walked on down the corridor with her papers. Harry would not write. He knew this about himself, not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't there yet, because the part of him that had learned this year to accept small acts of care was still new and uncertain about which acts were available and how available they were. He would file the offer somewhere he could reach it. That was what he could do. On the Hogwarts Express, heading south through the middle of England, Ron ate 5 cauldron cakes in a row to prove something to Fred and George that Harry didn't fully catch the context of, and Hermione read the entire journey and occasionally said things about the year that would have been at home in an academic review, and Harry sat with his feet up on the seat and ate more than he usually ate and looked out the window at the Muggle world appearing in the gaps between hills, and none of them mentioned what had happened below the trapdoor, and all of them knew they were not mentioning it, and none of them needed to. At King's Cross, the Dursleys were waiting on the other side of the barrier. Uncle Vernon had the expression he always wore when he collected Harry from places he didn't want to know about, which was the expression of a man looking at a situation he intended to manage by making it as small as possible as quickly as possible. Aunt Petunia stood slightly behind him, thin and dissatisfied, looking at Hedwig's cage, the way she looked at anything that came from Harry's part of the world, which was as though it had arrived specifically to inconvenience her. Dudley was eating an ice cream and not paying attention to anything. Harry put his trunk in the boot and got in the back seat, and the car pulled away from King's Cross and into the London traffic. Nobody asked him anything. The Dursleys drove in the way they always drove when Harry was in the car, without addressing him, without acknowledging him, without any of the sounds or silences that constituted the ordinary back and forth of a family. They talked over his head about Vernon's brother's new car and Dudley's upcoming birthday, and a neighbor who had done something to the garden that Petunia intended to address. Harry sat between his trunk space and the door with his hands in his lap, and Hedwig quiet in her cage beside him. They did not ask where he had been. They did not ask what had happened or who he had met or whether he was all right. They never had. For 11 years, Harry had moved through their house and through their life like a feature of it that they had decided not to engage with, and nothing this year had changed that, because nothing about this year had reached the Dursleys' house except Harry, and Harry they did not ask about. He looked out the window. The motorway expanded ahead of them, and the sign said, Surrey, and the car went south the way it always did, and through the glass, the English summer was doing what the English summer did, trying earnestly in the patches between clouds. He thought about July 31st, 1991. A pub on Charing Cross Road. A room full of people who had known his name for 10 years and shaken his hand and said nothing that asked anything of him. And then afterward, in the quiet, a very large man looking down at a small thin boy in oversized clothes with taped glasses and asking, "Where have you been all this time?" He thought about what it had meant to be asked. Not the answer. The answer had been the same facts it had always been, the same facts it would continue to be until July of next year when the blood protection would hold, and then the year after when things would shift in ways he didn't know yet, couldn't know yet, was not yet old enough to have the shape of. The answer hadn't changed. The asking had changed everything around it. The car drove south. The Dursleys did not speak to him. He knew where to write, if he needed anything. He knew September 1st would come again. He looked out the window and held it all quietly, and the summer went on around him, and somewhere out there, past the motorway and the familiar roads